Good morning, Professor Cowan, Dr. Barbara Daniel, and the newly appointed director, Professor Kim Wolf, and members of the organizing committee, and to all other attendees. My thanks to Professor Cowan and all the members of the organizing committee for the very kind invitation to address all of you this morning. To address you today is a special pleasure for me because I took several courses at King's in connection with reading for my LLM degree some years ago at the London School of Economics. It is my distinct pleasure to give back to King's, which gave so much to me. My only regret in doing so is that due to my commitments as a professor in Canada, I can only be with you through this video. Not the ideal way to participate in your symposium. This symposium marks the inauguration of the King's Forensics as a group incorporating the Drug Control Center at King's College and DNA analysis at King's, along with other forensic activities. The DCC was at the core of my work as the independent person, also known as the IP, that's me, where I led an investigation requested by the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA. As the IP, I was to investigate allegations published in the New York Times in May of 2016 that were raised by Dr. Rodashenkov, director of the Moscow and Sochi Doping Control WADA-accredited laboratories. The revelations in the Times were in regard to the institutionalized anti-doping control manipulation and cover-up conducted in the Russian Ministry of Sport and in part carried out at the Moscow and Sochi laboratories. That manipulation was part of a scheme to achieve sporting success at the Sochi Winter Olympic Games in 2014 and affirm the athletic prowess fueled with drugs of Russia. On this 40th anniversary of the DCC, I wanted to highlight for you the critical and essential role played by the King's Drug Control Center in the IP investigation. By this time, the IP investigation began in the late spring of 2016. There had already been a prior investigation commission of WADA, of which I was also a member, known as the Independent Commission, the IC. The IC had identified in-the-field cheating by doping control officers under the direction of RUSADA, the Russian Anti-Doping Agency, along with coaches and trainers and medical officials providing athletes with performance-enhancing drugs, known as PEDs. The IC also identified institutional involvement through the Russian Anti-Doping Agency and the WADA-accredited laboratory in Moscow. As a collective, they all participated in running an organized program in athletics to enable Russian athletes to cheat by using PEDs and not getting caught out. The scheme also involved criminal bribery and corruption within the Russian sport and the International Association of Athletic Federations, known as the IAAF, now led by Lord Coe, but at the time run by his predecessor. The IC uncovered a system within Russia for doping athletes directed by senior coaching officials of Russian athletics. This was accomplished by the corruption of doping control officers working under the direction of RUSADA. Athletes, coaches, doctors, and laboratory personnel were all involved in this scheme. Shortly after the mysterious death on Valentine's Day in 2016 of Nikita Kamayev, the former executive director of RUSADA, the events that I investigated as the IP came to public attention in May by the New York Times revelations of Dr. Grigory Rodashenkov, who was also a close friend of Kamayev and who had fled to the United States in fear of safety after the first independent commission report. At the core of the expose in the newspaper was the assertion by Dr. Rodashenkov the swapping of urine samples collected from Russian athletes at the Sochi Winter Olympics had occurred. The swapping system was largely based around the Duchess list. The list was prepared by the Ministry of Sport and contained a listing of athletes known to be taking the Duchess cocktail. This PED cocktail was developed by Dr. Rodashenkov. Those on the Duchess list had, with ministry officials' assistance, provided clean urine samples which were collected before the Sochi Games in order to swap for dirty urine samples taken at the Winter Games and sent to the Sochi laboratory. There were 37 athletes named on the Sochi Duchess list. During the Winter Olympic Games, 27 of those athletes provided 62 samples, later sent to the Lausanne laboratory for storage. All Russian athletes' samples cleared the Sochi laboratory as negative for the list of prohibited substances. After the Games, the samples were shipped to the WADA accredited lab in Lausanne, Switzerland for storage. Let me turn now to the swapping scheme. Russia's Duchess list athletes' urine samples collected at the Sochi Games were dispatched to the Sochi lab on site at the Olympics, then covertly transferred through a hole, which, as the IP I described as a mouse hole. The hole originated in the Sochi lab and ran to a room outside of the perimeter, which we named the operations room. There, in the operations room, the Russian Federal Security Service, also known as the FSB, had dropped off clean urine samples, carefully collected and stored earlier to be made available for swapping at Sochi. The original collection bottles were opened by the FSB, and Sochi lab personnel, led by Dr. Rodashenkov, swapped the clean urine sample into the original bottles. Then the bottles were passed back through the mouse hole into the aliquoting room for the Sochi laboratory to conduct its analysis, which would undoubtedly be negative. The result of this sample swapping process was no Russian athletes had positive adverse analytical findings at the Sochi Games. I should add here that after the completion of my investigations and the filing of my reports, an IOC disciplinary commission found 43 athletes to have committed anti-doping rule violations based upon information provided to them by the IP. 42 of the 43 athletes appealed to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, known as the CAS. Of that number, 28 were excused from the finding of an anti-doping rule violation. 11 were found to have participated in the scheme I had described and were sanctioned with suspensions and loss of medals or their results at the Sochi Winter Olympics. The disciplinary commission of the IOC described the scientific findings done by the Drug Control Center for the IP report as extremely strong. CAS added their approval to the process, saying that there was significant evidence establishing the existence of the Russian doping scheme in all 43 appeals. Now, with all of the foregoing as the background, I can now turn to the role of the King's Drug Control Center in my investigation as the IP. The whole newspaper story would be imaginary if the bottle caps could not be removed from the Berlinger doping control sample bottles and replaced without evidence of tampering. The industry belief was that the bottles were tamper-proof. I had no witness in Russia that had seen the process of cap removal occur. The Sochi sample bottles from the Winter Games were in a lab in Switzerland. I had to select a place to do the IP investigation work. Given its reputation as a pioneer in the drug testing, the King's College London Drug Control Center was chosen to conduct the testing for the IP investigation. Lab personnel had many publications on bioanalytics research, including drug metabolism studies, and developed the first tests for various prohibited substances. Looking back now, I'm very pleased that I made the decision to engage the DCC. It was the right decision. Having selected the London lab, the next step for me was to obtain the release of some of the samples stored by the IOC at the lab in Switzerland. I had them shipped from Switzerland to England to the DCC. On a lighthearted aside, some of you may get up during the night to use the toilet. There was a fear of foreign sources intervening during the transport of our precious urine from Switzerland to England. So instead of using the toilet late at night, one of my lucky investigative staff had the pleasure of getting to sleep surrounded by urine. I think I would rather just get up at the night. I engaged one of the world's foremost ballistic experts to conduct experiments at the DCC to determine if the caps could be removed from the bottles and replaced without obvious evidence of tampering. This was foundational to the investigation. If the caps couldn't be removed and reinserted onto the bottles, then there was no basis to continue my investigation, and the report of Dr. Rodoshenkov would have been fabricated. In a short 3 weeks, my expert reported success with the experiment. With the assistance and the cooperation of the DCC staff, the expert was able to remove the caps, put them back on the bottles. I had that process and the outcome of the experiments personally demonstrated to me with Professor Cowan present. The experiment was a success. The next step was how to establish if the Sochi caps had been tampered with. Following painstaking work conducted by my forensic expert and with the assistance of the DCC lab personnel, the Sochi bottles were physically examined. My expert was able to identify scratches and marks on the inside of the bottle caps, which bore a striking similarity to the types of marks and scratches that were present in the bottles on which the experiments had been performed. Presto! Verification of fact that the bottles were tampered with. I did not need a Russian witness to verify that Dr. Rodoshenkov had told me correctly what had happened. But I had to go further and verify the credibility of the rest of his story. Before I go on with that story, I should add that the IOC engaged an expert to assist their disciplinary commission. The Swiss expert was also able to verify the experiment conducted at the DCC. The bottle caps could be removed and then reinserted. The bottles were not tamper-proof, as everyone thought, but did leave evidence of tampering. The IP team then described this as the bottles were tamper-evident, but not tamper-proof. That was not the end of the involvement of the DCC. Dr. Rodoshenkov had said in the Times article, and to me in interviews, that at the time of swapping, adjustments had to be made by adding distilled water or salt to the samples to ensure the swap samples were consistent with the original sample information on the doping control forms obtained at the Sochi Winter Olympics. My expert, again with the assistance and cooperation of the DCC, tested a representative number of the samples, 6 of which had abnormally high salt levels. One sample was found to have a salt concentration about 26 times the normal human amount. In fact, the salt concentrations in those 6 samples were so high, no healthy human could have been walking around, let alone competing as an elite level athlete at the Olympics. 2 other samples had concentrations of salt below the normal concentration, also outside any possible amount in a healthy human. Given these extreme findings, it was clear that salt had been added to the over-concentrated samples and water had been added to the diluted ones, which corroborated Dr. Rodoshenkov's story. Dr. Rodoshenkov testified that while most athletes on the Duchess list had their dirty urine samples swapped with their own clean urine, certain athletes, mainly female ice hockey players, had been added to the Duchess list too late to collect clean urine samples in time for the games. Their dirty samples, therefore, needed to be swapped with other athletes' clean urine, not their own clean urine. In order to prove this, my team and the DCC personnel next tested for DNA inconsistencies in the urine samples. My expert, along with the assistants from the DCC, tested 16 samples from athletes who were on the Duchess list. DNA samples for these athletes were sent from Stockholm, Cologne, Lausanne to the London lab for comparative DNA analysis. Obtaining comparator DNA samples was time-consuming and thus expensive. My experts targeted the athletes whom Dr. Rodoshenkov recalled were added late to the Duchess list and would likely have DNA inconsistencies. Out of 12 targeted athletes, 2 female competitors' samples were found to be mixed with male DNA. Both sample bottles had scratches and marks that were indicative of tampering. 19 other Duchess list athletes were also tested. No inconsistencies were found for athletes known to be protected before the Sochi Games started. This confirmed Dr. Rodoshenkov's story to me that for those athletes on the Duchess list before the Games started, urine was collected under a state-sponsored doping system, while those who were added later had their dirty urine samples swapped with other athletes' clean urine. In order to fulfill my mandate, rigorous scientific testing was required. Only with the most modern forensic testing could the manipulation of the doping control process be confirmed with certainty. The DCC has played a historic role in the fight against doping. The center was the first to develop tests for a number of substances, including amphetamines, anabolic steroids, HCG, and dihydrotestosterone. Given its groundbreaking work in anti-doping control, the DCC was a natural fit for the IP investigation. Thanks in no small part to the DCC, under the direction of Professor Cowan, and DNA analysis at King's under Professor Denise Sindercombe-Court, one of the largest ever doping schemes was uncovered and verified. The scale of the activities in Russia rival those developed and used by the former German Democratic Republic, usually known as East Germany, before the wall came down in 1989. The DCC was pivotal in corroborating the story of the whistleblower, Dr. Rodoshenkov. They not only assisted in verifying that athlete samples had been tampered with through DNA, salt concentrations, and scratches and marks on the bottles, but also assisted in discovering how tamper-proof bottles could be opened and the contents changed. Due to this work, I was able to assess Dr. Rodoshenkov as a credible witness in the IP investigation. Despite all their great achievements to date, their greatest may be yet to come. I'm looking forward to seeing what King's Forensics accomplishes next. I'd like to thank them once again for the wonderful service they provided to the IP investigation. Have an interesting and inspiring symposium. Thank you for the invitation. And if you're interested in what I had to say, you can watch a film called Icarus, which you can find in the documentary section of Netflix, and it has a more full explanation of what went on in the IP investigation. Good day to you.